The colonel stood at the edge of the dusty training field, his boots pressed firmly into the gravel as if his weight alone anchored the authority he carried. Around him the cadets stood in two neat lines, rifles slung against their shoulders, faces taut with the strain of discipline and fear. He was known for his iron temper and cruel humor, a man who liked to break recruits with mockery before shaping them back into hardened soldiers. Among the line was Alara, the only woman in this batch, her uniform as clean as the others, her eyes sharp, unyielding, and yet carrying the quiet fire of someone who would not bend easily. She had already endured days of ridicule, whispers of weakness, and even open laughter from the men who doubted she could keep pace. But it wasn't their opinion that mattered today. It was the colonel's voice that carried over the field, sharp and mocking as he barked instructions. He made each cadet step forward, take aim at the row of targets and fire. One by one the men went, some hitting, some missing, and each time he gave either a grunt of approval or a smirk that cut deeper than any insult. When it was Alara's turn, she stepped forward with steady steps, her boots crunching over the gravel. She held her rifle properly, the way she had practiced alone in the shadows of barracks when the others laughed at her. She raised it, sighted the target, and then paused. The colonel tilted his head, already amused. "What's the matter, girl?" he barked, his voice dripping disdain. "Too heavy for you? Want one of the boys to pull the trigger?" A ripple of laughter swept the line of cadets, and heat rose on her neck, but Alara kept her focus. She lowered the rifle slightly and asked, with a calm but firm voice that carried across the field, "Permission to shoot at a live demonstration target, Colonel." For a second the air froze. The cadets stopped laughing, unsure if they had heard right. The colonel's eyebrows lifted, and then his grin spread across his weathered face, a grin of disbelief and mockery. He let out a loud laugh that echoed, shaking his head. "A live target?" he repeated, stepping forward, hands clasped behind his back. "Oh, you want to play tough, do you? You think you've got the steel for that? Maybe you'd rather shoot at me?" His words were meant as a joke, but the intensity in her gaze made him falter for just a heartbeat. Still, his pride would not allow it to show. He leaned in closer, so close she could see the lines carved deep into his face from years of command. "You wouldn't dare," he whispered low enough only she could hear, his smile still plastered on his face for the others to see. "You'd crumble before you even touched the trigger." He straightened and barked loudly so all could hear, "Go on then. Show us how brave you are. Take your shot if you think you're worthy of the rifle you carry." The men around gasped, half in disbelief, half in anticipation of what would follow. Alara did not move at first. Her silence stretched long enough that the colonel's grin widened, certain he had trapped her in hesitation. Then, without warning, she lifted the rifle with speed and precision that startled even the most disciplined soldiers present. The barrel lined directly with the colonel's chest, her finger brushing the trigger. The laughter died instantly. The air grew sharp and still. The colonel's smile wavered, the humor draining from his eyes as the realization settled that she wasn't bluffing, not even a little. Her stance was perfect, her aim unwavering, and the fire in her gaze told him she had already accepted what might come. For the first time in years, his voice faltered as he said, "Lower the weapon, cadet." But she did not. Instead, her calm voice carried clearly, "Respect is earned, not mocked." And in that moment, though no shot was fired yet, the colonel knew he had underestimated her, and for the first time in front of his men, his smile vanished completely. The silence that followed Alara's words weighed heavier than any explosion. Every cadet held their breath, their rifles forgotten at their sides, eyes darting between her steady aim and the colonel's stiff frame. He had faced countless battles, insurgents, and enemies with real blades aimed at his throat, yet never had he felt so naked as he did in front of a trainee, a woman he had mocked since day one. His jaw clenched as he realized the laughter of the men had not just died, it had turned to something else, something dangerous for him, respect for her. His pride screamed at him to lash out, to bark an order that would shatter her resolve, but the stillness of her hands and the steel in her gaze stopped him cold. He raised one hand slowly, not in surrender but in a gesture of control, trying to reassert his dominance. "You've made your point," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its cruel humor. But she did not move, her finger resting dangerously close to the trigger. The men shifted uneasily, some whispering, others frozen like statues. Alara finally spoke again, her voice calm, steady, and filled with a conviction that pierced the quiet. "All this time, you've treated me as if my place here was a mistake. You mocked me, laughed at me, made me a spectacle for their amusement. But I didn't come here to be your joke. I came to prove I can stand as tall as any of them. So tell me, Colonel, do you see me now?" The word struck harder than the rifle's recoil ever could have. The colonel's face flushed red, not from anger but from the realization that she had cornered him. If he punished her, it would look like cowardice to silence someone who had stood unshaken against him. If he backed down, it would unravel the authority he had built brick by brick over decades. The tension coiled tighter and the cadets waited, hanging on the edge of the moment. Then, in an unexpected move, the colonel stepped closer to the barrel, until the cold steel nearly brushed his uniform. His eyes locked on hers, searching, testing, and then something shifted deep within them. He saw not a reckless cadet but a soldier who would not break. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his hand on the barrel and pushed it gently downward until it pointed at the ground. "I see you," he said quietly, so quietly that only those closest could hear, but the weight of the words rippled across the line like thunder. Ilara finally lowered the rifle, her stance relaxing, though her heart pounded with a storm of adrenaline. The colonel turned on his heel, facing the cadets once more. His voice came sharp and commanding but without its usual cruelty. "Training is over for today. Dismissed." The men hesitated, unsure, then broke ranks reluctantly, glancing back at Ilara with expressions that ranged from awe to newfound respect. She stood still, the rifle heavy in her hands, unsure if she had won a battle or signed her own death sentence. When the field cleared and only the two of them remained, the colonel walked back toward her, slower this time, no mockery in his stride. He stopped in front of her, his eyes unreadable, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then he said, "You nearly crossed a line that can't be undone. Do you realize what that would have meant?" Ilara met his gaze without flinching. "I knew exactly what it meant," she replied. "And I was ready to pay the price if it made you see me as more than a joke." The colonel exhaled slowly as if releasing years of unspoken weight. "You're either the bravest or the most foolish cadet I've ever trained," he said. "Maybe both." He turned away, his voice quieter, almost reflective. "But one thing's certain, you have the eyes of a soldier who will not bow, not even to me." For the first time, Ilara saw no mockery in his expression. Instead, there was something she had never expected: respect. That night Ilara lay awake in the barracks, staring at the low ceiling above her bunk while the others slept in uneasy silence. Word of what had happened spread through the camp faster than wildfire, and though no one dared speak to her openly, she could feel their eyes on her, a mixture of fear, admiration, and disbelief. She had pointed a rifle at a commanding officer, an act that in any other circumstance would have ended her career before it began, maybe even her life. But somehow the colonel hadn't punished her, hadn't screamed, hadn't humiliated her as he usually did. Instead, he had dismissed everyone, and his final words still echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. "I see you." She replayed the moment over and over, the weight of the rifle in her hands, the stillness of his eyes when her finger rested near the trigger, and the strange calm that had settled in her chest when she had spoken. She hadn't acted out of rage or recklessness. It was something deeper, something she couldn't explain even to herself. Sleep refused to come, and when the dawn bell rang, she rose before the others, laced her boots, and stepped into the cold air of the training grounds. The mist hung low, and for once the field was empty, quiet, almost peaceful. She thought she was alone until she heard the measured steps behind her. The colonel emerged from the shadows, his coat buttoned tight against the morning chill, his face set in that familiar mask of control, though the sharp edge of mockery was missing. He stopped a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back, and regarded her in silence. At last he spoke. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice calm, almost conversational. Ilara shook her head. "No, sir." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Neither could I." He walked past her, stopping near the row of wooden targets set up for the day's drills. He tapped one lightly with his finger. "You have skill," he said, "and discipline. But skill without restraint is a danger. Do you understand that?" Ilara straightened. "Yes, sir." His eyes narrowed, testing her words. "You think I mock because I enjoy it? Maybe I do. But the truth is, I push every cadet to their breaking point to see if they belong here. Most of them will fold. Some will harden. But you didn't fold and you didn't harden in the way I expected. You forced me to see you, even if it meant putting everything on the line." He paused, and for the first time she thought she saw weariness in his face, the weariness of a man who had carried command for too long. "That's rare," he finished. Ilara stayed silent, her throat tight with the urge to speak but unsure of the right words. Finally she asked, "Do you regret letting me stay?" The colonel's lips pressed together in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Regret?" He shook his head slowly. "No. But I'll tell you this, You've changed the way the others look at you. That respect you wanted, you've got it now. The real question is what you'll do with it." The mist thinned as the sun crept higher, and the sound of other cadets approaching broke the fragile intimacy of the moment. The colonel stepped back, his voice sharp again though not cruel. "Form up," he barked as the others shuffled onto the field, startled to see him already there with Alara. The drills began, and though he pushed them hard, his eyes returned to her more than once, measuring, watching. The men no longer laughed when she outpaced them on runs or hit her targets with precision. Instead, they glanced at her with grudging acknowledgement, even respect, though none dared speak it aloud. By the time the sun dipped low and the day's exhaustion dragged at her bones, Alara knew one thing for certain. Something had shifted forever, and she was no longer just another cadet in the colonel's shadow. The following weeks unfolded with a tension that was no longer born of mockery but of expectation. The colonel watched Alara more closely than anyone else, his eyes sharp as if measuring every movement, every choice she made, and though his words were still commanding, the sting of derision was gone. The other cadets noticed too, and their behavior shifted gradually. They no longer whispered about her at night or laughed when her name was called. Instead, they began to fall silent when she passed, their gazes carrying an unspoken acknowledgement that she had earned a place among them through fire, even if none dared voice it. Yet respect among cadets was only the beginning. The colonel knew that the real test of a soldier was not on the training grounds but in the crucible of battle. He never spoke of his intentions, but one morning before the sun rose, Alara was summoned to his office. The room was small, its walls lined with maps and faded photographs of long-forgotten campaigns, medals resting in dusty cases that spoke of victories and scars both. He sat behind the desk, his posture straight, hands folded, eyes steady on her as she entered. "Close the door," he said, and she obeyed. For a long moment he said nothing, simply studying her, as though he were still unsure of what he had made of her that day on the training field. Finally he leaned back in his chair. "There's a live operation," he said. "Not a drill. Not training. An insurgent cell has been moving through the hills north of here, cutting off supply lines, ambushing convoys. We've been ordered to neutralize them." Alara's heart quickened, but she kept her face composed. "And my role, sir?" He tilted his head slightly. "You'll be part of my unit. You've proven yourself here, but this will be different. Out there, mistakes cost more than bruises to pride. They cost lives." She nodded once, firmly. "I understand." His eyes narrowed, searching for doubt, but he found none. Slowly he rose, stepping around the desk until he stood in front of her. "When you asked me that day if I saw you, you forced me to answer. But the battlefield is less forgiving than I am. Out there, if you falter, there will be no second chance. Do you still want this?" Alara's voice was steady. "Yes, sir." For the first time, his expression softened, just slightly, the faintest glimmer of something like pride passing through his stern features. "Then be ready. We move at dawn." The mission unfolded under a heavy sky, clouds pressing low as their transport rumbled through the rough terrain. Alara sat among the squad, her rifle resting across her knees, her thoughts sharp, steady. The men around her, once doubters, now looked at her differently, their silence carrying an unspoken trust that she would hold her ground as firmly as any of them. The colonel sat at the front, his gaze fixed out the narrow window, the lines of his face carved deeper in the dim light. When they disembarked, the hills rose dark and jagged, the air thick with the promise of danger. They moved in formation, boots crunching against gravel, weapons ready. Hours passed with only the sound of wind whistling through the rocks, but tension coiled tighter with every step. Then the first shot cracked through the silence, echoing sharp against the stone. The squad dropped low, returning fire toward the ridges where muzzle flashes flared. Dust exploded around them, bullets sparking off rock. Alara pressed against the ground, rifle steady as she sighted one of the flashes. She exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The figure collapsed in the distance, and for a fleeting moment she felt the weight of what she had done. No wooden target, no drill, this was real. The colonel's voice cut through the chaos, steady and commanding. "Advance by twos. Keep the line tight." They pushed forward, weaving through cover, trading fire. Alara moved with precision, her training guiding her body while her mind burned with focus. Once, a grenade landed near their flank, and without hesitation she dove forward, grabbing it and hurling it down a slope before it detonated, the blast shaking the ground behind them. The men who had once laughed at her now fought shoulder to shoulder, their lives bound to hers in the unyielding dance of survival. Through it all, the colonel's commands never wavered, his voice the anchor that kept them from being swept away by chaos. And though he didn't look at her directly, Ilara knew he was aware of every move she made, every shot she fired. By the time the last insurgent fell and the echoes of battle faded into the heavy silence of the hills, the squad stood battered but alive. Smoke rose from the rocks, the acrid scent of gunpowder clinging to the air. Ilara lowered her rifle slowly, her chest heaving, and looked around at the men beside her. Their eyes met hers, not with doubt, not with mockery, but with the simple, unshakable truth of shared survival. The colonel approached, his face unreadable, his steps deliberate. He stopped before her, and though his voice carried the same firmness it always had, there was no mistaking the change in his tone. "You didn't falter," he said. "Not once." For Ilara, that was more than victory, it was the acknowledgement she had fought for since the day she first stepped onto the training field. The return to camp after the battle carried a different kind of weight. The squad was tired, battered, clothes torn and smeared with dirt, but they walked with a silent pride that had not been there before. The transport jolted along the rough road and inside no one spoke for a long time. Ilara sat wedged between two soldiers who had once mocked her openly, and now their silence was not scorn but respect. Their shoulders brushed against hers as equals, and when she caught their glances, there was no laughter in their eyes, only the quiet recognition that she had stood her ground under fire and saved more than one of their lives. The colonel sat at the front as always, his posture straight, his face composed, though she noticed his gaze linger on her once or twice before turning away. When they finally rolled through the gates of camp, the waiting cadets and officers looked on, trying to read the outcome of the mission from the wear on their faces. No words were exchanged, but Ilara knew the story of what happened in those hills would spread just as fast as the tale of her defiance weeks before. Only this time it would not be told with mockery, it would be told with awe. That night, while the others celebrated with weary laughter and stolen bottles of cheap liquor, Ilara sat apart, the rifle resting against her knees, staring at the fire that crackled in the open yard. The flames danced and hissed, and in them she saw not victory but the faces of those who had fallen. The man she had shot, the insurgents whose bodies now lay scattered across the stones of the hills, their lifeblood soaking into the earth. She told herself it was necessary, that war demanded sacrifices, that they would have killed her squad without hesitation. Yet the weight of it pressed against her chest like an invisible stone. She was still lost in thought when the colonel appeared, his presence felt before she even saw him. He didn't sit, just stood a few feet away, hands clasped behind his back as always. "You're not celebrating," he said. She shook her head. "There's nothing to celebrate." He studied her quietly, the firelight casting deep shadows across his weathered face. "You think this makes you weak," he said. "It doesn't. The day killing feels like nothing, that's the day you've lost your soul. The fact you feel it means you still know what's worth fighting for." Ilara looked up at him, surprised at the softness in his tone, the rare glimpse of the man behind the armor of command. "Do you feel it?" she asked. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed ready to dismiss the question. But then he said, "Every time." He turned his gaze to the fire, his eyes distant as if watching memories dance in the flames. "I've seen men laugh after battles, seen them drink to forget, but the ones who survive longest are the ones who never let themselves forget what it costs. They carry it and it makes them fight harder to end it." Ilara's hands tightened on her rifle, the weight of his words sinking deep. For the first time she understood that beneath his cruelty, his mockery, his endless pressure, there was a reason. He had been shaping them, not to break them but to prepare them for this, the unbearable weight of living with what they had done. She lowered her head and whispered, "I don't know if I can carry it." The colonel stepped closer, his voice firm but not unkind. "You already are." He left her then, walking back into the night, his shadow long and unyielding against the firelight. Ilara sat for a long time after, the flames burning low, the camp growing quiet as the others drifted to their bunks. She knew sleep would not come easily, but when it did, it would be different. She was no longer the girl who had walked into the camp with something to prove. She was a soldier now, marked not just by her defiance but by the fire of battle. And though the burden of it pressed heavy on her chest, she understood that the colonel had seen something in her no one else had, and that recognition carried with it a responsibility greater than she had ever imagined. The days that followed the mission changed everything in ways Ilara had not expected. The cadets who had once treated her like an outsider now moved aside when she passed, not with fear but with acknowledgement. Some even sought her quiet advice during drills, asking about breathing techniques, sighting methods, or the calm she carried in firefights. She answered sparingly, careful not to draw too much attention, but she felt the shift like a current moving through the camp. She had become something she never intended to be, an example. The colonel, however, did not allow her newfound status to soften her training. If anything, he pushed her harder, his eyes on her whenever she faltered, his voice sharpest when her form wavered. To the others it looked like the same cruelty as before, but Alara sensed the difference now. His bark was no longer meant to belittle her but to forge her further, as if he had chosen her for something more than the role of another soldier in the line. One evening, after a particularly grueling set of endurance drills, when her lungs burned and her muscles screamed for rest, he called her aside. The men dispersed reluctantly, their glances following as she walked into his office. Maps once again covered the walls, lines drawn in red ink tracing enemy movement, supply routes and weak points. The colonel stood at the desk, his hands resting flat on its surface, eyes heavy with thought. He didn't look up immediately when she entered. When he did, his voice was low but clear. "You're not just another cadet anymore," he said. "What you did in the hills proved more than skill, it proved resolve. The kind of resolve this army doesn't see often." Alara straightened, unsure where this was leading. "What are you saying, sir?" His gaze pierced her, testing her strength even now. "Command has noticed you. Word spread beyond this camp faster than I would have liked. There are whispers of assigning you to reconnaissance teams, maybe even leadership positions if you survive long enough. But recognition is a double-edged sword. The more you stand out, the more enemies you make, inside and outside." Alara held his stare, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. "I didn't come here to be recognized," she said. "I came here to fight, to prove I belonged." A shadow of something like a smile flickered across his face, though it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "And you have. But belonging isn't enough anymore. You've stepped onto a path that doesn't end with being one of them. It ends with being more." He paused, then leaned forward slightly. "But that means sacrifices. The men will follow you now, but some will envy you. Higher officers may try to test you, push you to fail just to prove a point. You need to be ready for that." His words settled like stones in her stomach, but Alara did not flinch. "I'll be ready," she said. The colonel studied her a long moment, then nodded slowly as if he had expected no other answer. "See that you are. Because I won't shield you. I'll make sure you're prepared, but once you step into that light, you're on your own." He dismissed her then, and she returned to her bunk, lying awake again with the weight of his warning heavy on her chest. She thought of the men she had fought beside, of the faces she had seen fall, and of the strange respect in the colonel's eyes when he told her she hadn't faltered. It was clear now that the moment she had raised her rifle against him had not just changed her place in the camp, it had set her on a path she could never step back from. Days turned into weeks and more missions followed, each one harder than the last. Alara fought with unyielding focus, her resolve tested by blood, fire, and the endless grind of exhaustion. Each time she returned, scarred but unbroken. The other cadets began to whisper her name not with scorn but with a kind of awe, as if she had already become something larger than one of them. And through it all, the colonel watched, never offering praise openly but in his silence, in the rare softening of his eyes, she saw it, his pride. She knew then that whether she wanted it or not, she was no longer just proving herself. She was becoming something he had never expected the day he first mocked her request to shoot. She was becoming a soldier worthy of her own command. There are moments in life when silence speaks louder than words, when the heart begins to race not because of fear but because of an unexplainable pull that draws you toward someone, and as the days went by his mind could not escape the little things she kept doing around him, things that seemed almost unintentional but carried meaning if one looked closely enough, and he began to notice patterns in her behavior that suggested her feelings were far deeper than casual interest. For instance, the way she would unconsciously lean closer whenever he spoke, her eyes lighting up as if his words were the most important thing she had heard all day, and when laughter filled the air she always looked toward him first as if his smile validated her own joy. These gestures on the surface looked ordinary, yet beneath them existed a current of emotions that flowed like an invisible river pulling them together, and while he questioned whether he was imagining it all, his heart insisted that no, these were signs too consistent to be dismissed. She wanted him but struggled to admit it. The days rolled into nights filled with subtle interactions, long conversations, and glances that lingered longer than they should, and he realized that she revealed herself most not through what she said directly but in the accidental slips of her tongue, those phrases that escaped her lips without thought, words that betrayed her deeper desires, and the first of these came during an ordinary afternoon when they were walking back from a cafe, her voice casual yet carrying more weight than she probably intended when she said, "I always feel safest when I'm with you," and though she quickly laughed it off, he felt the sincerity behind those words, as if she had admitted something her heart had carried for a long time, because safety is not something people casually attach to another unless they see them as more than a friend, more than a passing presence. It was a phrase that hinted at trust, at dependence, at longing for permanence. That night he could not sleep, replaying her words in his mind, "I always feel safest when I'm with you," and it echoed like a melody that refused to fade, and in his chest there was both warmth and restlessness. Warmth because he longed for her too, and restlessness because he wondered how much longer they would keep dancing around unspoken truths. For every phrase she let slip was like a spark setting fire to his own hidden emotions, and though neither of them confessed openly, the universe seemed to weave these accidents as part of a larger confession that was building between them. Another day, in the middle of laughter, she blurted without thinking, "You always know how to make me happy," and instantly her cheeks flushed, as if realizing that happiness is not something one attributes so easily, and yet she had placed it on him as if he were the keeper of her joy, and he could see it in her eyes that she wished she could take it back, but the truth once spoken could not be undone, and deep down he cherished it, because her happiness mattered to him more than his own, and if he was the reason for her joy, then he felt like he had already found the purpose he never knew he was searching for. With each accidental phrase, the distance between them shortened, and though they still walked side by side like friends, something unspoken bound them closer, an invisible thread that could no longer be cut, and he found himself memorizing her voice, the way it softened when she spoke to him, the way it trembled slightly when her feelings slipped through, and sometimes when she thought he wasn't watching she would steal glances at him as if her heart could no longer resist. Those moments told him more than any deliberate confession could, because love often hides in silence but reveals itself in accidents, and her accidents were becoming too many to ignore. As more days passed, he wondered if he should confront her gently, should he tell her he already knew, should he confess his own heart before she drowned in her hesitations, but something held him back, a delicate patience born out of respect for her pace, for he knew that some truths bloom slowly like flowers needing the right season, and rushing them only risks breaking the stem before it can flourish, so he chose instead to wait, to collect each phrase she let slip, to treasure each accidental admission until the day came when she would finally realize that she had already said enough, that her heart had been speaking all along even when her lips tried to stay guarded. As the dust of all the confrontations slowly began to settle, the family realized that they had gained far more than they had lost, and while the ordeal had drained them emotionally and physically, it had also revealed their unshakable strength, their unity, and their unbending resilience in the face of every obstacle, and though the neighborhood still looked at them with a mixture of awe and curiosity, none dared to interfere with them again because the story of the general's daughter and the powerful family behind her had already spread far beyond the narrow streets of their community, becoming a kind of legend whispered with both respect and a hint of fear. Emily, who once felt suffocated by the weight of her father's military legacy, now found herself drawing comfort and confidence from it, because the very values he had instilled in her, discipline, loyalty, and courage, had carried them through the storm, and she had proven to herself that she could stand tall without losing her gentleness, that she could be both compassionate and unyielding when the moment demanded it. Her father, the general, had also been transformed by the events. Though he had spent most of his life leading soldiers, commanding armies, and confronting enemies, he had never faced a battle so personal and intimate, one that struck not at borders or nations but at the very heart of family and home. And in this confrontation he had discovered a tenderness within himself that military campaigns had long buried, a tenderness that now surfaced in every conversation with his daughter, in every protective glance, and in every word of guidance that carried less of the general's bark and more of the father's warmth. Even the neighbors who had once aligned themselves with the HOA began to view Emily's family differently. Where they had previously seen only an enemy to be undermined or coerced, they now saw guardians of principle, protectors of fairness, and examples of how to resist exploitation without sinking into hatred, and though some still nursed resentment or envy, most came to acknowledge that it was because of the family's stand that future abuses would be less likely. The HOA itself, once arrogant and emboldened by years of unchecked authority, was now fractured and weakened, its members divided, its reputation tarnished, and its grip on the community broken, for the story of how a young woman had stood against their bullying and how her father had revealed his towering stature as a general had left a permanent scar on their image, a reminder that power built on intimidation and deceit could collapse overnight when confronted by integrity and courage. For Emily, life slowly regained a sense of normalcy, though normal would never again mean quite the same thing, because she carried inside her the memory of every insult, every moment of fear, and every flicker of courage that had burned in her heart when she thought she might not endure, and those memories became a part of her strength, a reservoir she could draw upon in future trials, and though she never sought confrontation, she knew she would never again shrink from it. Her father sometimes looked at her with a kind of pride that words could not fully capture, a pride born not from her obedience or conformity but from the discovery that she was every bit as formidable in her own right as he had ever been in his uniform, and he knew that she would carry the family's legacy into the future not by repeating his path but by carving her own, one rooted in empathy as much as in resolve. The bond between them deepened, strengthened not only by love but by shared battle scars, for though their roles had been different, they had both faced the fire together, and in that crucible they had forged an unbreakable alliance of father and daughter, of general and civilian, of protector and the protected who had become a protector herself. And so the story moved beyond the confines of a single neighborhood dispute and grew into something larger, something symbolic, a reminder whispered from one household to another that ordinary people, armed with courage and unity, could challenge institutions that seemed untouchable, and that even the most relentless tide of opposition could be resisted if one refused to bow. Emily sometimes thought about how strange it was that a simple act of defiance against unfair rules had unraveled into a saga that reshaped not just her own life but the lives of everyone around her, and though she bore the marks of that struggle, she would never trade them for an easier path, because they had revealed who she truly was, and more importantly who she could become. And in the evenings, when the sun dipped low and the sky blazed with colors of fading fire, Emily and her father would sit together in the quiet of their home, sharing stories, laughter, and the kind of silence that spoke louder than words, knowing that no matter what storms the future held, they had already proven they could weather them side by side, unbroken and unafraid.